Oh yeah. Hey yo, it's the Russo Show. Hey yo, it's the Russo Show.
Hello and welcome to Pizza Film School. This season, we're exploring the world of AGBO's essential creative partners. These talented individuals work their magic behind the scenes, contributing their expertise to the variety of components involved in creating a film. In this episode, we're exploring the world of film scoring, accompanied by an extraordinary guest. Our friend and composer, Henry Jackman, is the artistic powerhouse behind the soundtracks Captain America, The Winter Soldier, Captain Phillips, and the popular video game Uncharted 4, A Thief's End. We have had the privilege of working with Henry on several different projects, from the MCU to the AGBO films, The Gray Man, Cherry, and Mosul. We're very excited to have you here today. Welcome, Henry.
Thanks for having me.
Henry, how are you?
Very good, very good. That was such a nice introduction. Whoever wrote it, I'd like to hire on a kind of more regular basis.
That would be our producers, Sophia and Sarah.
Fantastic.
Yes, thank you to them.
They're great hype women.
They also helped me create, for this episode, an AI version of my brother.
Fantastic.
Joining us today here.
It's looking
This is AI Joe.
very convincing.
Sorry, I'm pulling a Max Headroom today.
Okay.
I'm not in Los Angeles at the moment. I got to say that pizza looks amazing, though. What are we eating today?
It is amazing. I'm sorry that you can't eat through the screen, but this week we are having pizza from La Sordid, which is located in the Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles. We have a margarita, which is
Keeping it
Henry's
simple.
request. Yeah, and I went with a burrata pie. We have a slice here waiting for you, Joe, when you return.
The technology's not quite there for you to munch that little slice of pizza, but...
Because I'm AI, I don't have any taste buds. Henry, sir, we always start with asking our guests, one, how you found your way into music, and then two, how you found your way into film composition. So just give us your backstory.
My dad was a musician, and my parents were a bit despairing because age 4, I was found stealing these little stickers and putting them on the keys of the piano because I would find certain keys that I liked bashing away when I was about 4 or 5. And in order to remember, where that was on the piano, I'd be scrubbing felt tip marks on the piano for all these different areas where I knew little patterns that would make nice sounds. So they were like, we got to get this, we got to get him piano lessons. And so it started off really classical. I was really lucky to get into, I got almost a Harry Potter experience, really. In England, you get these like cathedral choirs that are super famous, like St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, all this kind of thing. And there's a school that literally is just the choir for the cathedral, right? So normal schools have a whole bunch of people in it. This school had 38 people in it.
Wow.
And it was the 38 people who were the choir for St. Paul's Cathedral. So I did all these auditions and whatnot, and I got in.
At what age?
I think it was 8. So, I guess by modern educational standards, this is borderline child abuse, right? Like I'm being sent off, to some repressive boarding school. Like I didn't see my parents, but I saw them for 2 hours every 2 weeks or so.
Wow.
That's what happens when you want to be in the film business, right? You get sent away and... you gotta pay a
Meaning
fine.
it was good training.
Yeah, right.
Good training for the future. But I tell you what was really good about it. Aged 8, you're part of a musical endeavor that has the same level of professionalism as the London Symphony Orchestra or, the LA Phil or something. Meaning every day in St. Paul's Cathedral, you go and you show up to a service and evensong is sung. And we, the boys, were the trebles and the rest of the choir there. And the standard expected of you is the same as if you're in the Vienna Boys Choir or some major. It would be a bit like you're into soccer and you get shoved into the Real Madrid kind of reserve, youth team really early. And you just get used to getting training sessions with like Kaká and Ronaldo and, meaning the standard was super high and we had to, and also musically, I was singing music from like medieval music right through to modern 20th century music, thinking that was a normal thing to do, doing like 4 hours rehearsal every day, and it was super strict. And when I look back on it, I said, well, wasn't that sounds a bit, bit much. It doesn't sound like much fun, but I didn't really know any different. We even had to stay there on Christmas Day. Right?
Wow.
I remember because there was like Holy Communion. But I remember the Christmas Day at St. Paul's Cathedral being like one of the most exciting days of my life,
Wow.
Which shows how relative everything is. You only know what you know, right?
But that is amazing. I mean, I can't think of a more thorough or intense early training than that. In music, how long did you stay at the school?
It's from 8 to 13. A lot of the kind of formal training I had in music was to do with being a performer, right? So if you want to be a concert pianist or some kind of high-end performer, what's really happening is previously written music, you interpret and you practice so you get good at playing it. But quite early on, I had these kind of cosmic experiences in that choir where I'd be singing some piece and I would be almost reduced to tears. Like all the hairs on the back of my neck would go up and it would be this most amazing piece. And I'd be thinking, what's the alchemy? Why is that? Why at bar, 60 of this piece of music do I completely lose it? Because it's almost like overwhelmingly brilliant. If you want to find out the secret to Coca-Cola or Chanel, they're not going to tell you, right? It's like a commercial secret. But the crazy thing about music is you can go and get the score, because I'd only be singing, the top line. I've got to figure out why is that so special. And I'd go and get the full score and I'd go to the piano and I'd be like, right, so it's this chord. I wish I had a piano here, I'd just be going, okay, so if you use this chord and this chord, it'd be like, if you want that really uplifting feeling, and you're in E flat major like this and blah, 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 it was like the kind of underlying code of how certain pieces work were being exposed. And it always amazed me that other people weren't that interested. I quickly lost discipline in like practicing, my piano so I could play through the piece. I was more like, let me look through to bag all the secrets of how to make things.
That's amazing.
Do you know what I mean? Which, in retrospect, what was really happening, I guess, is I was figuring out more the composer end of things. I was never going to be good enough. For a start, I honestly don't think I would have been good enough to be a concert pianist. But also psychologically, what I was actually doing was figuring out why. Not I am going to become the best person at playing this down. More, let's go under the bonnet and figure out why, in the first place, this piece of music is so damn good anyway.
When you were finishing your time there at St. Paul's, where did you go next? Did you continue with music or did you change gears?
Yeah, my parents come from like a humble background, so it was kind of cool and lucky to be at the St. Paul's Cathedral choir school. One of the teachers there suggested that I should go to Eton College, right? Which would be inconceivable. I don't know what the equivalent is in America. From our family history, that'd be like, what are you talking about? That's like literally where that's where Prince William and it's like a super posh school, way too expensive. And they're like, no, you can if you get a scholarship, you don't pay anything.
Wow.
There are two kinds of scholarships, and academics. The school was actually set up, I think, by Henry IV, who was feeling a bit guilty about various things he did in his life. And in those days, I guess they felt like, they could cleanse their soul at the last minute. And he set up a school for 50 scholars of the kingdom, poor and true, kind of, that was the origin of the school. They had to be poor scholars. Wow. And it subsequently became, a very wealthy school, but they had scholarships for music. So I tried for a scholarship and I got one. My parents didn't have to pay for the education, carried on the, similar kind of classical education. And then round about sort of 17, as you might expect, having had non-stop
classical.
Yeah, borderline merchant ivory, everywhere. Beautiful posh buildings, very traditional English. Then suddenly, that was it. I was done. 17 years old, home computer, sampling, rave culture, staying up all night, too cool for school. Didn't want anyone to know I was any good at classical music. Lots of hooded tops, lots of like drum and bass. And, I went off on a completely different musical direction after that, which actually I think at the time, my parents were like, oh my God, I can't believe after all this, he was going to be a concert pianist. Now he's going like, and they could hear all these beats coming out of the bedroom.
But that's really, you're very cutting edge in the way that you blend your classical influences with modern influences. And I'm assuming this is where it all started, right?
Right, because it's not an affectation. What actually happened, you know what it's like, you're 17 years old, I'm done I don't want to do any more Debussy. And this thing was kicking off in the UK in the late 80s, early 90s. There was a full cultural thing happening to do with like house music and acid house and breakbeats. And all I wanted to do was, stay up all night jumping up and down to this stuff. Suddenly there was this other kind of music that was completely unacademic, unclassical, that is really good. And if I hadn't had that experience, I think I might have been more of a musical snob. Yeah. It was really, because I loved it, I remember really clearly this experience of, there was a cool American called Inner City. It was a really famous, like, seminal dance track that came out of Chicago. And because of the way they were using technology, they had a whole chord just on a single note. But as a result of the kind of guerrilla techniques they were using, it produced, quote, like the wrong kind of harmony, as it were. So when I first heard it on the radio, I was like, wait. You can't go C minor, F minor, B flat minor? That's like so parallel. You've got to make that D flat a D natural. It's jarring my ear. But it jarred my ear because of all this hoity-toity, you know, etiquette. Once I was jumping up and down till 3 a.m, sweating like a lunatic, dancing to this stuff. I was like, hey, it sounds great. So what I mean by that is I was so grateful for the fact that I have a really historic musical education that goes all the way back to like medieval plainsong and through the whole classical tradition. But then I spent like a whole decade almost putting that to one side. I often try and tell my mum, it's like, you know, she used to kind of have a go at me when those beats and weird noises were piling out of my bedroom aged, 16. It's like, you know what? It was a good thing.
For Joe and I, it's been a magical thing because like one of the things that we've always been attracted to artistically is like combining two things that seem incongruous or seem like they're in conflict, and just seeing what you do when you mash things like that up. And your ability to move between like the best version of classical musical power and sort of cool, funky electronic music has always been like blown our minds. We love it.
It set the tone for Winter Soldier. I mean, the movie doesn't work without that score. It was a reinterpretation of a 70s paranoid thriller. So it had to have some classic influences, but also had to have a modern edge to it. You have Cap, who's this character who is a man out of time, so he can bring those sort of more classic compositional moments, but then you have this very grungy, nasty, edgy character in the Winter Soldier, this half machine character. I don't remember when it was specifically, but I remember the day we came to see you while you were working on the score, and you said, I want you to listen to this.
Yeah.
And you played this really intense sort of, is this, and you said it was a human voice that you had manipulated.
It's been processed a lot. Yeah.
And that was when we found the movie.
I remember, like, when you played that, I feel like it was one of my happiest moments in filmmaking when I heard that for the first time.
You guys have to give yourselves credit, because I think I'd had enough of an impression of you guys to feel the artistic permission to just go for something pretty outrageous, even though, because you would think that if you haven't worked with people before, maybe play it a bit safe, because if you create a super unfavorable impression really early on, you got some rowing back to do. But I think the conversations I'd had with you guys, you'd given a strong direction of artistic bravery and that spirit, which means that that insidious, nasty little worm that can creep in, which is the worst, most destructive thing of artistic fears. Everyone should always try and go for their like bravest idea. If it's as what's that expression Joe has? It's a swing too far. Okay, if it's a swing too far, fair enough. But at least it was a swing. I remember Matthew Vaughn saying, "Listen, whenever I get to a crossroads, and I'm not sure, just take the brave option." Because if you screw up and it was like the weak option, you're going to feel like such a dick, right? You might as well just be brave until there's no bravery left to be had,
Yeah.
It's a great piece of advice.
But so that Winter Soldier suite that I wrote, I had two choices. I could think about Kevin, or I could think about, the Russo brothers who I just met. And, it might not be the very first piece I would play Kevin. Maybe play him like the Cap stuff first before giving him this serrated, drum and bass dubstep influence, gnarly screaming, He freaked me out in the funniest way. When I first met him, he goes, film music's got nothing to do with music. And it's like he deliberately says something so counterintuitive that you need a few steps, go, hang on, wait a minute. Obviously, self-evidently, like film music is about music. But, let's see where this goes, right? He goes, no, it's not about music. It's about storytelling. It's just you use music to tell the story. But it was a very brilliant piece of mental guidance, because it shocks you out of thinking in slightly selfish terms about what you want to do with music, and makes you engage in the discipline of what is the purpose of this piece of music narratively.
Yeah.
And then music is being used in collaboration rather than some self-satisfied operation where you're just doing, whatever you want.
Well, that is one of the things that we've always really appreciated about you and your process is that you do have this very sophisticated sense of story. We always say, like, everybody we collaborate with on a movie, all our key creative collaborators, each one of them, we want to be a fully rounded filmmaker. From early on, Joe and I could tell your sense of story was so sharp, and your sense of narrative pacing was so sharp. And I think that was probably what emboldened us and made us feel comfortable to get very experimental with you, because you seemed so tuned in to the guidepost through the movie for all of us, which is the storytelling.
But that's also a compliment to you guys. Again, the fact that you guys have the attitude of collaborating with people where you're happy to hear about something that they may have to say outside of their specific discipline. That the phrase you just used, you know, of wanting people to feel like they're participate, you know, as an overall filmmaker.
Larger movie.
Obviously, the final call on anything is you guys, right? But that in itself, that level of collaborative encouragement is something that any director should really, I don't know what profile of people listen to this, but that is the way to go rather than the micromanaging, maniacal. Because if you think about it, you've got all these people, and you don't have to do whatever it is they say, but you always want to engender a scenario where the best of everyone is coming out, rather than people feeling, you know, that they can't make comments or experiment.
Yeah.
And that Winter Soldier, just going back to when I first played it, I wasn't just going, oh, how many weird noises I can make. It was back to that intellectual discipline of what is the Winter Soldier, right? The Winter Soldier is Cap's best buddy in a kind of RoboCop fashion, has been subdued and contorted and is now mechanized and stuck inside, you know, in a sort of psychotic relationship between human spirit and technology, you know. So that's why it sounds like it does. It wasn't me just going, oh, I'm going to be cool and not use too much orchestra for the first four. And the reason that iconic scream took so long to make is that, to me, represents the feeling of one of our sort of most revered and favorite characters who's been transformed in a hideous way. You know, it's, in other words, it's back to that hands thing. It's for a reason. It's not self-indulgence.
No, it was the perfect expression of character. Like you said very eloquently at the time as well, it was just this, his humanity had been so suppressed within him and was just sort of coming out in these very distorted, perverted ways.
But not every, I mean, you know, I can imagine directors I've worked with where if I played that piece of music and that's the first thing I played them, they'd have a, you know, a minor heart attack and then declare that that isn't film, you know. So it may seem like, oh, Henry goes off and just does this stuff and then plays it to us. But actually, even when you're not around in that formative stage, there's this sort of weird spiritual permission, you know, even when you're not around. So the fact that you've engendered that kind of a feeling is a great compliment to you. And I imagine that also happens in all other fields of your filmmaking that isn't music.
Henry, let's come back to Winter Soldier in a second. I want to ask you about Hans Zimmer.
So I would say by pure luck, but I don't know how much, yeah, it's difficult to know how much things are pure luck in life. I'd spent ages on this, looking back on it, potentially pretentious album that was quite influenced by Björk, called Transfiguration, where I'd taken some classical pieces that were quite famous and then kind of reinterpreted them, not dissimilar to what we're talking about. It was sort of half glitchy electro weirdness, half beautifully recorded choirs and orchestras and whatnot. It was pretty original. I don't even know quite why I did it. I just needed to do it. And a friend of mine had given it to Bob Badamy, who's a great associate of Hans Zimmer. He's worked with him for years. And I cannot imagine how many things, how many CDs, how many, God knows, that are trying to, you know, get there, you know, that never even make it. But I think he'd listened to it, and he actually walked into Hans's room and said, I know you're busy, but I actually think you should listen to this, because I haven't heard anything that this sounds like nothing that I actually know. So whatever, you know, Hans listens to it. I think he called me straight. As I recall, I had a confusing experience where I'm on the phone, and in the background I can hear something that I've written, but from a sort of stranger's call. So it's slightly weird. And he's like, you know, and he's kind of doing this, like, is this your piece? I'm like, hello, sorry, who is this? He said, this is Hans Zimmer. I'm like, oh, well, very nice to meet you. And he said, well, you know, you should come and we should talk. I said, I'd love to talk to you. So I went down to his studio, and he's not only is he a great composer and producer and mentor and all the rest of it, he's actually very erudite and, you know, fun and interesting person. And you know what? I honestly think to this day, I benefited massively from his need to procrastinate. I think what was happening was he needed to nail a couple of themes for Da Vinci Code.
Okay.
And he just could, and it was super convenient. So I started this conversation with him, and it went on and on. We were talking about life, the universe, and everything. And the music editor would come and go, Hans, you know, we really need to. And he said, no, I'm having a very important meeting with this English guy. I'm sure he was using it, you know. I was the beneficiary of him making out that this was some super important meeting, which it absolutely wasn't. I was just some green idiot that he was hanging out with. And then I started doing the most, you know, basic bits and pieces. And I didn't even know how to lock up my rig to picture. And I didn't even know some of the really, you know, if it's students who are watching this, it's a reminder that there's all the art and the philosophy and all that, which is what I love to concentrate on. But don't forget, there's all the there's all the blue collar stuff you've got to know inside out, you know.
Will you talk a little bit about the blue collar stuff?
Yeah, well, just meaning stuff like, okay, so I'm used to the record industry. Now there's a completely different setup. There's all these like giga samplers which are not used now, but we used at the time. It's a very complicated setup. I've got to figure out how to get my sequencer to plug into Pro Tools. I've got to figure out, you know, like picture sync. I've got to get all the picture into the rig safely without, you know, I don't want to wake up in the morning and see a headline that, you know, the picture leaked. But to be honest, some of the biggest lessons I learned from Hans were those big picture lessons to do with never forget that film music, what you're really doing is you're a storyteller. You're a storyteller, then your job is to use music to tell the story. You should be like your director's lieutenant, only you have all these musical chops. So instead of, because imagine, I remember Hans having this conversation with me, imagine how stressful it is for a director, right? You have this great vision, if you're lucky enough to work with good directors, they have a great vision of what they want to do. They're not composers, right? So they can't exactly, if you're lucky enough that they are musically coherent, they'll have a way of communicating, that's great. But they're not composers, otherwise they'd do it themselves. So imagine how frustrating it is when they want to just show up and they want to hear something that makes them go, that's exactly what I wanted, or even better, that's more than what I imagined it could be. And the only way you can get to that place is you have to understand and collaborate to understand what it is that they're trying to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think that's another thing that has been so energizing and helpful in the relationship with you. It's like, yes, we aren't musicians. We're obsessed with music and we love it, but I had to admit by like 13 or 14 that I couldn't play. So to be able to communicate with you about story.
But it's better that way. I think there's nothing worse than like, oh, Henry, do you think, you know, the viola divisi should be like, maybe use the third violins and put the viola on this? That's not an important conversation. Yeah. An important conversation is, you know, this scene should pre-lap the operatic feeling that we're gonna, you know. I remember in Cherry, some really interesting ideas you guys had to do with, we've lived with this cue for a while that you've written, Henry, but you know, now you've written this other crazy dark thing that appears later in the film. Maybe there's a counterpoint thing where in all that kind of crazy training that Cherry goes through, let's take a version of that piece that you wrote for later and let's like lay the pipe for it in a, and I'm thinking, I mean, this has happened to me before with you guys where often the very fact that you haven't been involved in the minutiae of writing the piece liberates you guys to come up with suggestions where I'm going, oh, wait, hold on a minute. I remember, I think the very first time I played the Winter Soldier Suite, it starts off very moody and it builds, and then like all hell lets loose. And I think it was Joe said, oh yeah, you know that bit there where all hell, just do me a favor, stick that, you know, over the scene where, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I remember going, whoa, hold on, that's a bit much for that. Wouldn't it be the kind of more, no, just shut up, just, you know, just try it. There's something liberating about not being over-involved in the minutiae of something, which often means you can actually have a better vision than the person who's right on top of it. And that happened in Cherry a couple of times.
For sure. I mean, Cherry was so experimental in our execution from start to finish that we were available to everything. We were interested in being inspired by all of your work and then figuring out how and where, because the editorial on that was so fluid that you would compose things that then would inform the way we looked at the structure, right? And then it would imply tone and it would imply theme and it would imply character. And so we're gaining information by hearing things. And then by moving pieces around, we're able to experiment with tone in different ways at different parts of the movie, playing against expectation.
When I first started out, I was so much more kind of micromanaging about like, this is written here, don't move this here. You know, this music editor experimented with some piece and he moved something and put it there. It's like, whoa, don't do that without, you know. By the time we got to Cherry, it was the other way around. I started to get this interesting feedback loop in which the pieces that I'd written started to yield unexpected results from the positioning and how you guys were putting it together. You really need trust to be able to do that. You know what I mean?
Well, there's a question, and we like to cut to music, so it's critical to get those pieces. I know we push it for content early because play it on set for tone, we'll play it in editorial for tone, you play it to an actor. Sometimes you can communicate more to an actor by listening to 2 minutes of score that is associated with his character than you can in hours of conversation. You know, the hardest thing I think for any filmmakers to communicate because in essence, it's their fingerprint is tone.
Yeah.
And music communicates tone better than anything. Sometimes lighting can do that. Sometimes framing can do that. But music really is the driver of tone.
No, it's definitely true. There's no doubt that what's so powerful about music, because it isn't tied down with semantics, dialogue, however poetically written and beautiful dialogue is, you need grammar and understanding and words and clarity and all the rest of it. Music just operates on this level that can be so powerful and influential that my recommendation to any of your budding directors who listen to this is just make sure you really spend a lot of time focusing as you guys do. Not that you deprioritize anything else, but you can ruin something with the wrong music.
That's a great point. Yeah, Henry, remember probably my favorite moment when we were sitting there at the very end of Winter Soldier, right? It's when Cap is unconscious on the shore. You know, Bucky pulls him out of the water, looks at him, and then walks away. And we were sitting there, and I don't remember how the conversation started, but the idea was, well, what if we just stripped it down? Yeah. And then you kept pulling instruments out, and then you went, hold on. And you got up and you went over to the piano, and you just played the theme along to the picture. You improvised.
That's right.
This lovely single piano piece that just captured really intense emotion for a movie that just had this enormous CG third act. And the sort of beautiful piece about love and brotherhood, the sadness of this broken family, these two characters that may never have back the things that they lost. You hear it and go, oh, that's the shape of the film. That's the theme of the movie. That's what the characters are feeling that they're not expressing. It's shot in slow motion. Nobody's speaking. It's telling me everything that I need to know in a couple of notes.
It's interesting you say that, people not speaking, because there's always a feeling that you got to cram in exposition, you got to explain everything, and you got to... I often feel like some of the most memorable moments of filmmaking are the more abstract. I bet if we wrote down some of our like top 10 moments in all cinema history, I bet you a lot of them are great visuals and music, and I bet you they're not exposition scenes. But so many, I mean, the moment that you mentioned is etched in my mind. The reason I was able to strip that all down and make it quiet like that is the filmmaking went quiet. After all the craziness and the magnitude of what had happened in Winter Soldier, it did actually boil down to this key scene that was really an intimacy. It was like a brotherhood scene. And it wasn't noisy, and no one was talking. Now, you need confidence. I mean, you guys have it in spades, but I would say to, you know, anyone listening, you don't underestimate the power of, you know, if you don't have the right music yet, you know, just if you're lucky enough to work with a composer and you trust them, just always remember to have the confidence you can have a stretch of filmmaking where you see something and you hear something beautiful. No one needs to explain anything and no one needs to talk about it. If you don't believe me, watch Terry Malick, right? Because then you get 9 minutes of a river before you get...
Well, to hear you speak of that makes me think of the end of Cherry. And again, it's like the marriage between image and music. So the last 7 minutes of Cherry, there's practically no dialogue. There's 2 small lines of dialogue. One line is thank you, and one line is good luck. It's like meaningless dialogue. There's essentially
it's
no
not
dialogue.
It's not exposition.
Anthony and I seem to be most delighted by, and I think it's what we responded to in the Daniels work when we saw it was, and why we consider Cherry a companion piece with our first film Pieces, is we like taking absurdism and crashing it like a car crash into emotion, right? And seeing what comes out of it. And I think a lot of it has to do with our upbringing in Cleveland, and the city was by turns tragic, but also ridiculous. You know, we had a ridiculous style of dress when we were growing up. The river caught on fire, the mayor's hair caught on fire. It was the butt of a lot of jokes. So it always, to us, life seemed farcical, but there was always an underpinning of like jobs lost and industrial decay and sort of the more sort of soulful, tragic elements of the industrial Midwest. And so the movie is really reflective of this really wacky combination of emotional depth and ridiculousness. And, you know, I think probably difficult from a composition standpoint for that reason. But it all builds to what I think is the most beautiful piece of music you've ever done, which is that score for the last 7 minutes. Just talk a little bit about your process on Cherry and how it led to that final piece.
Well, I'm really glad you asked me that, because this last piece, is kind of a culmination and a vindication, funnily enough, of a process that I've been building over time. I've had experiences before where I'll write a suite or a piece, which I think is in some way a summation of everything to do with a movie, that either through my inexperience or through the tribulations of the film doesn't come to pass, doesn't really feature in the film. So what was interesting about this Cherry piece is I kind of went into a deep meditation to write an extended finale piece, funnily enough, away from picture originally. This is before I'd even seen the picture. I'd been talking, our collaboration had by then gone through Captain America, Winter Soldier, Civil War, Mosul. You know, we'd got a creative collaboration, a shorthand and a way of communicating with each other, such that in the midst of COVID, I kind of went into my lab. I wrote a Cherry suite that was this long 10-minute piece, which to me was the sort of emotional summation of everything that I thought this movie was about, which I may have done, you know, before, but it had never landed. And as we came to the end of the movie, I went back to that original piece that I'd written, that original suite. Now, it's not exact, you know, it's not like I just hit play and played it down. It got rearranged. But what was so gratifying was that this piece that I'd written, as it were, almost like a concert piece of music, like away from picture, you know, like the piece you'd play at the Walt Disney Concert Hall, to go, do you have a piece that in some way encapsulates not a specific cue, you know, some piece that encapsulates this whole movie? This last piece in Cherry, this last 7-minute sequence, was heavily, heavily arranged and structured around this piece that I'd written. This is something, again, I learned a little bit from Hans. I felt like it was a vindication because I'd got better. In other words, the fact that this original piece I'd written flowered into the piece that is at the end of Cherry meant that whatever that conception was that I'd come up with in the collaboration, the discussion with you guys, actually did have this essence of what the movie was and did end up being the last piece in the movie, you know, as opposed to like, oh, well, you know, I wrote this interesting suite, but it ended up, you know, in the bin and I did something else.
But they're very helpful for us, Henry, because we would pull out sections of your suites and edit to them, right? So that's how we, again, discover tone.
Exactly.
You give us a sprawling 10 minutes that goes through a complete range of emotions, character moments, high moments, action moments, low moments, and then we're able to pull a minute or 2 minutes here and there and start putting it to picture and then discovering what the tone's going to be.
The fact that you do that, you created that suite and that's your process, I mean, that fires us on a creative level, right? That's starting to shape how we think about the movie, what is possible within the movie in terms of how we tell the story, because we have this music that didn't exist before you created it.
Yeah.
And we could have never conjured before you created it.
Right.
So all of a sudden you brought something to the table that was all of a sudden became like an essential building block.
It takes a while to get good at it, meaning I don't think in the first few films I was doing, I probably relied more on let me see the movie, let me see the scenes, let me start writing the cues. It's only as you get more experience, because you need a bit of creative fear in a way, meaning if you make the proposal, I'm not writing to a particular scene, I haven't yet seen extensive footage of this movie, and I'm going off on a big, some of these, it takes me sometimes 10, 12 weeks to do these things. You could be forgiven for thinking, what am I doing, right? I mean, how do I know this is the right thing? When I first started doing these large suites, I'd enjoy it to start with, and then there's a middle period where you sit there questioning yourself, going, what the hell is this? Because there's a lot more confidence involved. If you're working to a specific scene, you can rely, as it were, on the mechanics of the scene and the sort of more craftsman-like elements of scoring to a particular scene. When you're in more of a vacuum, which is artistically braver, but potentially more hazardous, because you could go off, I could write some huge piece and you go, Henry, that's a phenomenally interesting piece that has absolutely no connection whatsoever, But I've learned to live with that, meaning if you don't at some point go through that period of self-questioning, then you're probably not doing anything very interesting. If from the minute you start a piece of music to the minute you finish it, you are completely confident at all times that there's nothing to be worried about, you're probably doing something so generic. But I come back to the compliment to you guys. The reason I'm able to stay in that lab, writing that big Cherry suite for however long, or the Grey Man suite, which took me, forever, is on your shoulder. There's different voices you can have on your shoulder. You can have a voice on your shoulder of what are you doing? I gotta sell tickets, right? Or you can have a voice that you know is going to be going, no, Henry, you know what? Go with it. Go for it. That the level of ambient, unseen creative encouragement is what allows you to just keep going. And that's what happened in that Cherry Suite. It's what happened with the Grey Man Suite.
As directors, we get to collaborate with a variety of people who are contributing to the movie in different ways, design or acting, music, cinematography, etc. Before an actor shows up and gives a performance, we have words on a page, we have dialogue on a page, we have our ideas about how the scene should play. But then an actor shows up and actually performs something. And that changes all your preconceptions about what it was, and it becomes something different. And the same thing with design. Sometimes you can have all these ideas about a set, then you walk onto the set when it's finally finished, and it's like, the whole thing just all of a sudden takes on new colors and hues and textures and possibilities. It's the same thing with the music that you created. It starts to become a creative force around which the movie starts to shape itself.
That's it.
As we go forward. It's been really remarkable working that way with you. I want to shift gears now, and we have another scene that we wanted to play, which is the Civil War airport battle scene.
For any filmmakers listening, often it's collaborative discussions which really give you that feeling of permission. One of the concepts we discussed was that of opera. So it's particularly self-evident at the end of Civil War when you get that giant battle, between Cap and Winter Soldier and Iron Man. And at that point, it's not really an action scene at that point. It's like Clash of the Titans. It's a fight, but the mechanics of the fight give way to the opera of the clash kind of thing. Up until this point in the movie, there's a lot of grounded elements. I can't remember all the locations now, but, Cap's in some chase in a Nissan at one point, Now, when you get to the airport, it gets a bit more mythological, because suddenly you don't get a lot of German police or FBI or other elements. Now it really is a clash between superheroes. I mean, there's quite a lot of politics involved. The subtlety of why we've ended up with two different camps within the superheroes is actually quite sophisticated, and to do with the accountability of what it is to be a superhero. Now, obviously, people can watch Civil War and just enjoy it because it's a great spectacle. But if you wanted to get geeky about it, it's also to do with, if you really did have superheroes, then, are they public service? Are they private sector? Like, who are they answerable to? Do we need some accord? Do we need some UN accords? Should we sign them? Cap's argument is like, no, we can't. Look, if we start signing some UN accords, we're just going to become puppets of some bureaucratic institution. I think we should just rely on our judgment, which I guess would be like a kind of libertarian argument. Meanwhile, Stark is like, well, that's pretty arrogant, saying that we're always going to make the right call. I think we should sign these things. At least I don't have to feel so bad about when things go wrong. There's some interesting causal factors for how you get the two sides. And what's great about this scene is the sophistication of how we got here takes a back seat, because guess what? We've ended up with two teams, and they literally smash into each other. The big Civil War theme that had been hinted at in the movie has a full expression, when they first come together. But as they run towards each other, there's an ostinato based on the harmonies of this theme that has a certain tempo and pace to it. It's like dun 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 pom 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 gun 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 gun, and it's building it. It's coming. And then when they actually clash, instead of driving faster and harder, it kind of slows down. The ostinato drops out, the tempo drops, and it's a huge, classical, rhetorical statement of the Civil War theme. When the moment of these two teams coming together occurs visually, funnily enough and counterintuitively, in a way it slows down. And I really learned something, and I think we all learned something in that moment, because it's such an important moment. Why wouldn't you kick the tires musically on what to do? But funnily enough, the gear you pull to go even bigger is to pull out the pace and go for the full Beethoven statement of the tune, and we really kicked the tires on that, and that was really gratifying. So I would say the first half of that scene is a bit more mythological. Yeah. My job wasn't really the dynamic action. I mean, that there's pace to it, but it wasn't really about the action. It was more about the sort of mythological representation of two warring superhero factions, like it might have been Zeus versus, Apollo. Then after that amazing sequence where you see almost all the characters sort of in one amazing CGI shot, then when it gets more into the kind of individual fights, that's when it gets more into kind of the piece becomes more of an action piece. So I would say it's really divided into two sections. First of all, establishing the kind of overall titanic mythology of the opposing superhero forces. And then as the fights get more individual and it breaks down, it got more into the kind of nitty-gritty of, you know, all the crazy moves that are happening.
Yeah.
Henry, by the way, you do something so well that really helps out Winter Soldier and Civil War critical moments. And it's the underscoring of the heroic moment for the lead character. In Winter Soldier, it's when Cap fights the Quinjet on the bridge, right? And there's that great moment where he's on the motorcycle and he's racing at it. And it's a rousing theme. It's the theme that comes back at the end of the movie that climaxes when he lands with his shield in the concrete at the end. Yeah. Boom, he jumps down. The second time you do that, and it's a trick, and it's almost a companion piece to this one, is in Civil War. When Stark is leaving the prison after having told off Ross, he goes in the helicopter, and he presses a button, and the nanosuit builds up around him, and he falls out the back of the chopper and takes off. And it's so rousing. It used to make the hair stand up on my arms. But what's so brilliant about it is it's a complete misdirect. We are selling the audience.
Yeah, that's true. 100%.
Positive outcome. All right, here we go. We know that they've been fighting the whole movie, but get ready. His suit's on.
Yeah.
He's going to help Cap and Bucky, and they're going to go fight some super soldiers. In a lot of ways, the movie doesn't work without that moment because it's the crushing blow that when you get there, you realize
it isn't that.
Oh no, we're in a thriller. You know, we're in a very dark thriller, and Zemo is walled off in this room. And when that tape starts to play, that sinking feeling, the pit of your stomach hits, and you realize you've been had in a way.
Yeah, it's actually a sort of tragic opera at the end. But that moment you're talking about is more a Superman moment. There aren't that many opportunities to have like unbridled, unashamed, earnest, straight-faced heroism, right? I mean, it being 2023, you know, it's not like we're in it's a cynical age, right? I mean, when the Captain America, I did the research when I first worked with, you know, I read some of those original Captain America online graphic novels, and they were basically governmental propaganda. Mm-hmm. You know, it was like, how to spot a communist. If you spot a communist, inform your parents. And, you know, it was an age where if you said, Sentinel of Liberty, no one laughed, right? It was pre-Vietnam, you know, I don't know, post-Second World War, the Nazis had been dispatched. You could be unalloyed in your respect for the heroism of like American 20-year-olds running up and down a beach in France, sacrificing themselves to liberate Western Europe, right? So meaning the areas of musical endeavor where that kind of heroic, because if you look at the history of heroism in music, and I'm trying not to waffle for too long, but one of the things I love about my classical education is I love the music of like Richard Strauss and Wagner, these huge, I mean, they're a bit overblown, and again, in the context of 2023, no one would write them. They made sense in 19th century Germany, these giant symphonic heroic pieces like Strauss's Ein Heldenleben, and you know, those have had an influence on me, and they show up, if you look at John Williams, things like the original Superman movie has got these phenomenal, I think even more than Star, my favorite John Williams score is Superman. Yeah. It has incredible, heroic, Straussian leitmotifs, right? And I love drum and bass, I love dubstep, but I also love, you know, big Straussian orchestral rousing music. So that's why this kind of comes full circle, meaning despite all the cynicism of 2023, you do need scenes, and it does still mean something to people, to have a scene where you do need to feel uplifted. And that has a musical heritage to it that comes from like Aaron Copland, Fanfare for the Common, you know, these pieces that would be difficult to write now because people go like, wow, you know, this isn't relevant to the modern age. But I think you do still need a musical connection with something that is heroic and that isn't in any way pastiche or that doesn't got any irony. I remember listening to an interview that Brian Eno did in relation to, it's heroic in a different way. They were talking about the Joshua Tree, funnily enough, the classic U2 album, and an era of synth pop, and it's like, well, this album has got Bono going on about like where the streets have no name. It's kind of uplifting, semi-religious, and you know, it's not very cool. It's kind of quite earnest and quite heroic, and like, you know, what's that all about? And Brian Eno's thing, he said something I never forgot. He said, if you are obsessed by being cool, it's just a form of cowardice. Because all you're doing is trying to figure out what is the surface agreed language of the day, which, by the way, will have changed in a heartbeat, and then conform to it. What was so cool about the Cat films that you did is it had all of it. It had the political intrigue, it had realism, it had groundedness, it had more psychologically realistic elements than, say, you know, the Richard Donner Superman movie. But then it still had a connection to some real, you know, uplifting moments. And as a composer, I love all that, you know.
One of the things that we've always been grateful about with the films, like the Marvel films, where you're working in fantasy, is it allows you to step outside of our sort of contemporary hang-ups about these ideas, about heroism or what's cool, you know, all that kind of stuff, because it's no longer necessarily your real world that you're looking at.
I mean, it gives you a bit of freedom in that respect.
Exactly. It sort of allows you to tap into some things you may feel awkward tapping into in a realistic situation.
Exactly.
Which is very fun.
Yeah, but you know what? They resonate, though. People, it doesn't matter if it's 2023 or 1023 or 1523.
Right.
I swear to God, there's certain elements of just human conduct that stay the same, to do with sacrifice or realizing you have to do something that's painful for yourself that will benefit other people. That I'm not sure human beings on some weird mythological level change that much. And that's why I think some of these movies do so well, because they do tap into some of these kind of primal you know, ideas that are, you know, maybe a little more awkward to tackle if it's a super realistic movie.
Yeah. Toward the end of the sessions, we do these things called small bites.
Got it.
Which are intended to be...
Keep it quick.
Very quick, simple.
Two-word answers.
Simple, yes.
No
exactly.
one ever keeps them quick, Henry, but...
Yeah. And by no one, we mean especially
watch
ourselves.
Watch
as
this.
well.
I'm going to do 12-word answers.
Okay, so if you could watch any piece of content for the first time again, and I'm going to expand this, not just watch any piece of content, but for you, even listen to any piece of music, what would it be?
My problem is I'm so bloody eclectic. If it was a piece of music, it might be Respighi, Pines of Rome, last movement.
Wow.
Just blew me away. You'd have to listen to the piece. Classical music often, you know, sort of comes and goes in dynamics, a bit like suites that one writes, right? It's a piece that just starts off with a simple pulse as the Romans are marching down the Appian Way, and it just grows and grows and grows and grows. I heard it live in the Royal Festival Hall, I think, when I was about 9. And I already had every single hair up on the back of my neck and all of my arms thinking, this is the climax, and we were halfway through the piece.
Wow.
It kept getting more ridiculous. It got more and more incredible. And then when finally like 10 extra trumpets stood up at the end, it was almost a narcotic musical experience. I didn't know it was possible to physically sit in a chair and acoustically encounter something. That would be on the classical side. I think on the other side, it would have been in a club called Rage at Thursday night, 2 in the morning in 1991, listening to Fabio and Groove Rider play certain drum and bass tracks. So those would be the companion pieces.
Awesome.
If you could work with anyone dead or alive, who would that be?
If it was a composer, this is going to be really obscure, so people have to look it up. It would be Scriabin, who was a complete lunatic. And
That's totally obscure.
Yeah.
Mystical, crazy music. I was probably not worthy. I'd probably end up just like doing little small pencil markings on his score. It wouldn't be much of a collaboration. Because he was, just to give you an idea of this guy, Scriabin was a composer. I hesitate to use the word Debussy because he was harmonically really interesting and had very atonal understanding of harmony and whatnot. This is way before technology. He ended up in a position where he wrote a piece where his intention was that it was to be a 24-hour musical experience in the Himalayas, right? With a full kind of mystical setup, and everyone would ultimately depart their physical body and have some sort of transcendent experience. The guy was, I would be fascinated to hang out with him. And you know what? I think Terry Malick.
Wow.
Anyone who's prepared to have, if you look at the Rotten Tomatoes score for New World, it's shockingly, unacceptably low. Anyone who's prepared to have opening shots of a river of Virginia for a disturbingly patient amount of time with Wagner in the background pretty much holding a chord of C major, and before you even know anything about anything, gets my vote. Don't worry about exposition yet. Don't even worry about context. I'm going to give you a feeling, and I'm so confident I'm going to give you that feeling for like 5 minutes before anyone has any idea about what's going on. But perversely, the other thing about Terry Malick that's interesting is some of the detail. In Days of Heaven, it would actually become a good history. If you wanted to know what American agriculture was like in the Midwest in whatever that year was, it's a very well-researched, as well as being a beautiful story, it's almost a historical tool that could be useful to anyone interested in studying American agriculture at that time. You know, it's a fascinating combination of exquisite detail and huge, broad brushstroke poetry.
Okay, this goes back to your...
Oh, that wasn't 12 words, what the hell? Okay, this is gonna be a quick one.
It's okay, back to your choir days.
Yes.
What is your go-to karaoke song?
Oh, karaoke. Because it's in my range, believe it or not, Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer.
Nice, okay.
Although I can't do
I'll
it.
take that.
He's such a good singer.
What is your favorite piece of music?
I mean, that's borderline impossible.
On your deathbed, fading away, and you say, press play on this for me.
Just well, as I leave planet Earth.
But if your deathbed was
Nicely organized.
at this very moment, not 20 years from now, not
Okay.
30 years from now, not 90 years from now.
You know, it might be Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. It's a bit heavy.
Really?
But it might be Benjamin Britten. I mean, you know, I guess I was thinking about, well, you know, if we're talking about death, you've got to get a bit high-minded, right? You don't want to go out on a bit of banging drum and bass.
Beautiful.
Henry, we want to thank you for coming in today and chatting with us, eating some pizza, drinking an Aperol Spritz.
Well, 2.5 at least. Oh, that was great.
You're one of our favorite folks to work with and one of our favorite folks to hang out in the room with. So this has been a lovely conversation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Mangia bene. We'll see you next time on Pizza Film School.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Oh, wow, yeah, man, it's Pizza Film School. About to learn about the movies, man. Whoa, it's real cool.